Elon Musk and his Doge team have uncovered more alarming spending habits after they gained access to the USAID database. This included funding heroin production in Afghanistan and a trans comic book in Peru. I've also acquired the comic book itself, so we'll take a look at that in a minute as well. And also we're going to look at the Doge members whose personal identities and information got leaked online, putting their lives at risk. Initially, Musk was met with resistance when trying to access the USAID database, which is data that multiple Congress people have been trying to get access to for years now.
Going back several years, where I was trying to investigate the expenditures for humanitarian aid, primarily when it came to the war in Ukraine. And what my team and I encountered was absolute obstruction and lies coming out of USAID. They did everything possible to stop me from accessing their records to understand where our taxpayer money was going.
This is due to tens of billions of dollars a year being spent without public explanation of where the funds are going. Elon Musk says that the reason he diverted investigative attention towards US aid is because, in his own words, all Doge did was check to see which federal organizations were violating the President of the United States executive orders the most. Turned out to be USAID, so that became our focus.
Well, that was always the goal, was to reform it. But now we have rank insubordination. Now we have basically an active effort where their basic attitude is, we don't work for anyone, we work for ourselves. No agency of government can tell us what to do. So the president made me the acting administrator. I've delegated that power to someone who's there full time, and we're going to go through the same process at USAID as we're going through now at the State Department. I think there are this is not about getting rid of foreign aid. There are things that we do through USAID that we should continue to do that makes sense. And we'll have to decide, is that better through the State Department or is that better through something, a reformed USAID? That's the process we're working through. There are things that are happening at USAID that we should not be involved in funding, or that we have a lot of questions about. But they're completely uncooperative. So we had no choice but to take dramatic steps to bring this thing under control.
Do you think that we'll still be the most generous nation on earth at the end of this process?
I think we'll be the most generous nation on earth, but we think we're going to be the most generous nation on earth in a way that makes sense, that's in our national interest.
The chief of staff for USAID, Matt Hobson, resigned as Doge gained access, which many speculated then that his resignation maybe signaled corrupt practices that he was partaking in. You'll see here 2 top security officials were fired for attempting to block the Elon Musk-run Department of Government Efficiency's access to classified material in restricted areas. Doge spokesperson Katie Miller did not respond to requests for comment, but did repost the AP article on X with the comment, "No classified material was accessed without proper security clearances." Doge then released to the public a list of some of what was deemed wasteful spending. To name but a few, it included $1.5 million to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in Serbia's workplaces and business communities. Over $40 million was allocated to projects between 2014 to 2019, where Ben Hu, an investigator involved with Wuhan labs in China, was studying coronaviruses in bats, among other research activities. So a lot of the speculation over the last few years has been further confirmed that COVID did in fact start in the Wuhan labs, and the US government was funding the research. $70,000 was sent to Ireland for a production of a DEI musical, $2.5 million for electric vehicles for Vietnam, $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia. Now, for the $32,000 for the kids' comic book in Peru, I found the comic book, and it is a series of 3 short comic stories, all centered around trans people and coping with COVID restrictions. It was about a trans woman legally changing her identity on her identity card. The books do also try to push the agenda of transgender surgeries and hormonal treatments for trans people. Here are a couple of quotes from the book where they describe the trans characters. He is currently a 30-year-old trans man who has only been able to perform 8 months of hormonal treatment due to lack of money. I also just wanted to point out, because I didn't notice during filming, but the other character also had not gotten hormonal treatment yet due to lack of money. And that's a kind of trend amongst the characters. He is 1.6 meters. He's of thick build, especially because his back grew with testosterone. So if you look into it, in Peru, there is elevated violence against LGB and trans people. There, in 2023, there were some trans people who were actually killed. And that's obviously something that you don't want happening in the world. It's a sad thing to hear about people being violently attacked or murdered just because they're gay or trans or whatever. So I understand where the sentiment comes from. I understand why there might be a feeling of we want to help to do something to, you know, aid towards people in Peru maybe being more open-minded, because in an ideal world everyone would just kind of leave each other to their own thing as long as they're not harming other people. So I get it, but at the same time the US is $36 trillion in debt. So is $32,000 for a trans comic book in Peru worth the investment? If the US was in a surplus, then I would understand more if they were wanting to send money around the globe to help the social situation in different countries. But the fact is that the US is in debt, and there are still people living in tents who lost their homes to natural disasters. So now let's have a look at the US government's funding of the production of heroin in Afghanistan. Now, to some people who've been paying close attention, maybe this doesn't come as a surprise. Some people have said that this was actually pretty obvious, because while the US was in Afghanistan, the production of heroin was extremely high, whereas before and after, whilst the Taliban controlled Afghanistan, it was very, very low. I actually have a video from a few months back, I believe, of this man talking about his first-hand experience in Afghanistan, seeing the poppy fields and being told that Americans had allowed them to be there.
Afghanistan used to be a net food exporter. And as soon as the U.S. takes over, they're producing 93% of the world's heroin.
That's right.
I'd like to know how the fuck that happened.
Yeah, I would too.
As far as your eye can see, all there is poppy. All of it is poppy. So I said, I want to talk to a poppy farmer. They were like, are you nuts? And I said, no, I'm serious. I want to talk to a poppy farmer. So we go out to the poppy fields. We see this guy cultivating his poppy. So I go up to him and I said, I got to ask you a question, which was incredibly naive. I said, why don't you grow crops that have 2 growing seasons instead of poppy? You could grow tomatoes or onions or pomegranates. And he goes like this. He goes, the Americans told me in 2001, if I told them where the Arabs were, I could grow all the poppy I wanted. I go, what Americans told you could grow poppy? And my military handler's like, we gotta go. Bogey's in the area. We gotta go. And he physically pulls me into the Jeep and takes me back to the helicopter. I was like, okay. So I make an appointment to go to this DEA secret site. Somebody had reached out to me and said, hey, we heard you're doing this study and you might want to come out here. We can have lunch nearby. I was like, okay. So I get in my car, I drive out to Timbuktu, outside Washington, friggin' far, and there's this secret DEA facility out there. So there are 3 of them. We go out to lunch, and they were like, you're in over your head. I said, how do you figure? They're like, there are very powerful forces that want that poppy to be cultivated. And I said, why? It's 93% of the world's heroin. And they said, because almost all of that heroin goes to Iran and to Russia. And we want them to be addicted to heroin. It weakens their societies.
Almost all of it goes to those 2 places, and it's 93% of the world's heroin?
Our heroin comes from Colombia and Mexico and Ecuador.
What about the Andretta, though, getting the heroin from Afghanistan?
That happens too, but it's small scale.
So that's a really interesting take on it. But of course, there was a massive opioid epidemic in America. And some people have pointed out that once the Americans pulled out of Afghanistan and the opioid crisis kind of disappeared, that suddenly the fentanyl crisis appeared in America. I guess what they're alluding to in that is that the US government has actually been funding these drug crises for their own profit. I did actually see a reporter trying to dismiss the spending as not really a big deal because it was just a fraction of the overall spending.
I'm sorry, can I follow up on what you just said there? You
Please
want to
do.
authorize purging of State Department personnel? What does that mean exactly?
Well, if you want to take a look at the State Department, where DEI has been a priority over, let's say, diplomacy in many accounts, I could give you hundreds of examples
What
of where they
proof
were
do you have of
authorizing.
that?
Sure, let's list them off. $500,000 to expand atheism in Nepal, $50,000 to do, let's see, a transgender opera in Colombia, $47,000 to do an LGBTQ trans comic book in Peru, $20,000 a pop to do drag shows in Ecuador. Shall I continue with more examples of where DEI
It
was the
certainly
priority?
seems like there could be a review of things. Foreign aid, as you know, is less than 1% of the entire federal budget. So we're talking small amounts of money by comparison.
We're still talking about tens and tens of billions of dollars.
But the problem is that that's the mindset that actually leads to all of the debt. I'm sure it's very easy for one agency 100 different times throughout the year to say, oh, it's only $32,000. Yeah, put that there. Oh yeah, that's only 60,000. It's such a small amount. Put that there. But if you have one agency doing that 100 times a year and another agency and another agency, and they're all doing it, the next thing is the US is in $36 trillion of debt. But with all of this, Doge has gotten a lot of attention, and Wired released an article revealing the names of the 6 workers. They're young men who are working for Doge. They're clearly very gifted young men. Here's a video of one of the boys. His name is Luke Fartour.
So I've always been interested in history. Growing up, I learned Latin. I was never that good at it, but I was always kind of into that sort of stuff, read a lot about the Roman Empire and things. And one day I was just listening to a podcast back in March. It was with Nat Friedman. He just kind of got on the podcast, explained like, there are these burnt up scrolls that were buried in the Pompeii eruption. No one knows how to read them. But some professors have created CT scans of these scrolls, and they uploaded the data on the internet as a competition to see who could find writing inside of these scrolls. And when I heard that, I was just immediately like, oh my goodness, this is such a cool project. I have to work on this. I just went home from work that day at the end of the day, and I've been working on it evenings and weekends ever since. I just spend hours upon hours staring at flattened pieces of the scroll like this, trying to find these patterns which are part of the writing. At the start of the challenge, we had not been able to find any writing at all within these scrolls. There are hundreds of these scrolls that are from the mansion. We've scanned a couple of them, and no one had been able to find any writing in them using these methods. Late one Saturday night, I was sitting at a party at a friend's house in Omaha, and I get a text from another person on the challenge team, and he says, hey, I've just uploaded this new kind of piece of the scroll, you should take a look at it. I remotely access my computer, I type into it like, please run the algorithm on this new piece of scroll. And then I just kind of started. I pull out my phone again, just nonchalantly like, hey, I wonder how that went. And there are 3 Greek letters on the screen. And I completely freaked out. My friends were there, I was cheering, jumping up and down, screaming, crying, all the stuff. I, took a picture of the results and I sent them to my mom. She called me and she's like, hey, these look great, It was a really special moment. Yeah, so this is the word that I actually found. It's right here. It's the word prophoros, which translates to purple. This would not be possible without modern AI and modern scanning techniques. People have wanted to read these books for hundreds of years. Now we're reading entire paragraphs from the scrolls, and hopefully we'll be able to read the entire book and read the hundreds of other books that were buried in this condition as well.
Some people have argued that it's normal to have public officials' names be in the public, that the public would know who is working in the government, and that's a fair enough point. But this reveal by Wired has actually left these young men very vulnerable now, basically with a target on their heads possibly for the rest of their lives, because obviously the work that they're doing in cutting all of this spending is upsetting a lot of people, and many powerful people who were benefiting from the spending. We've actually seen users on Reddit and Blue Sky who are very, very hostile about Doge, and they've already begun discussing violence against these young men. And some of the things that they're saying are just appalling. I'll leave it on the screen. I'm not going to read it out loud. But basically, they've been saying that they know where these people live. They've been able to figure out where these people live, and they don't want them around anymore. So these young men are going to have to be given a security detail from now on if they haven't already. But so far, Doge does seem to be doing as promised during the election campaigns, and the US debt clock, as of this moment, is saying that Doge has saved $55 billion so far. So this will be very interesting to keep an eye on as time goes on. How do you guys feel about what Doge has been getting up to, and how do you feel about the data that they've released about the government spending? I'm really looking forward to hearing your opinions, and as I like to say, your opinion really does matter, so please do share it, and I'll see you guys next time.